Ladies and gents, good afternoon. It is 4 o'clock, a little bit after. I see the participants are coming in. Great, welcome. My name is Anton Fedyashin. I am the director of the Carmel Institute here at American University, and welcome to the second of a year-long series of talks that we will be hosting devoted to the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoyevsky. We did this year specifically because it is the 200th anniversary of his birth, or will be exactly in the fall of this year. And so we're continuing to explore Dostoevsky through the latest cutting-edge works on his life, his works, his thought, his everything from scholars from all over the world, including, of course, the United States. Just a few words in terms of shop. We are recording this session. That's number one. Number two, we will conduct the Q&A not face-to-face virtually, but through the Q&A function. So if you have a question either during the talk or immediately after, please look at the bottom of your screen at the Q&A function and type in your question, and I will be reading them off to Professor Givens at the end. And finally, the welcome to our speaker today. John Givens is professor of Russian and the chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Cultures at the University of Rochester, where spring probably hasn't yet fully come, although it doesn't feel like that in Washington today either. He's the author of Prodigal Son, Vasilii Shukshin in Soviet Russian Culture. He is the co-translator of Shukshin's Stories from a Siberian Village, former editor of Russian Studies in Literature. But for us today, most importantly, of course, he is the author of a new book that came out in May of 2018 called The Image of Christ in Russian Literature, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Bulgakov, Pasternak. And he will be giving a talk essentially about his book, but sort of with an emphasis on Dostoevsky today. And with that, I open the floor up to John.
Thank you, Dr. Fedyashin. It's a pleasure to be here on a late Friday afternoon from Rochester, New York. And I want to thank the Carmel Institute of Russian Culture and History for inviting me to come talk about my book. This isn't quite a book launch, but I will say, since the book's been out a bit, I will say that the talk is fortuitous in its timing because the book will be issued or reissued in paper by the end of this year and has just been translated into Russian to be published and sold and distributed in Russia sometime in the next 6 to 8 months. So there is an occasion for me to, I think, bring the book back to the public attention. My talk today, I'm going to share screen here. I have an illustrated presentation for you that we're going to run. There's the cover of my book. And we are going to, I'm going to do this up here. We are going to, my talk is about 35 to 40 minutes maximum, so there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. I have two parts in my talk. The first part is, let's see if I can get this to work, Belief in Dostoevsky's Russia. Part two is Belief in Dostoevsky. So I'm going to start a little bit, since Dr. Fedyashin teaches a class this semester called Dostoevsky's Russia. We're going to talk about belief in Dostoevsky's Russia, and this is also from the book. So if, as I argue in my book, the 19th century was the century of unbelief in Russia, then we can reliably date the advent of that age to 1838, when Leo Tolstoy recollects the following thing happening in his book, Confession. I remember when I was 11, he writes, 11 years old, a high school boy named Volodya, now long since dead, came to see us one Sunday and announced the latest discovery made at school. The discovery was that there is no God, and that everything we were being taught was pure invention. This was in 1838. How contemporary 1838 feels. I remember my older brothers taking a great interest in this news and even allowing me to join in the discussion. We all, I remember, became very excited and took the news as something very enthralling and entirely possible. The father of Russian literature, Alexander Pushkin, had just died the year before, 1837. He was the first and most prominent Russian writer to express unbelief in his writings, most famously in 3 poems from 1821, expressing irreverent attitudes towards his own faith, ranging from the body to the blasphemous. To choose the least offensive of the 3 I have in mind, I will quote from his poem, To Davidov. My proud reason scolds my repentance, and my atheist stomach says, have mercy, brother. If only the blood of Christ were a good Chateau Lafite or Clos du Vougeot, I wouldn't complain. But as is, though it's funny to say, it's like drinking diluted Moldavian wine. 3 years after Pushkin's death and 2 years after Tolstoy's childhood incident, Pushkin's heir apparent, Mikhail Lermontov, creates the first bona fide materialist of Russian fiction, labeled as such, as you can see, midway through the novel. Grigory Pechorin, from Hero of Our Time, a jaded cynic who has replaced belief with skepticism in his life. He looks at the starry skies and marvels that humanity once thought to look for aid from the heavens, since, unlike past generations, this one passes, quote, with indifference from doubt to doubt, just as our ancestors rushed from delusion to delusion. Similar attitudes of doubt and skepticism are encountered in the works of almost all of the major writers of the 19th century, from Ivan Goncharov to Ivan Turgenev to Anton Chekhov, and including, yes, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. But in calling the 19th century in Russia the century of unbelief, I do not wish to argue that a great secularism descended upon the country between 1800 and 1900, due to which no one believed in God anymore. On the contrary, as you can see, Orthodoxy was alive and well in Russia, which by 1914 boasted these numbers of churches, chapels, priests and deacons, monasteries, convents, monks, and nuns. Russia was truly a Christian nation, united by a single faith, whose calendar of feast days and fasts regulated the daily lives of millions of peasants, merchants, and members of the nobility. Icons occupied places of honor in the corners of rooms, and Orthodox practices and beliefs made up a common cultural fabric that bound all levels of Russian society together. At the same time, however, there was a growing conviction, mainly among the educated strata of Russian society, that religious belief was something of a cultural atavism, whose place in human society had long been superseded by the sciences and the ascendancy of rationalism as a guiding principle. One of the most eloquent champions of this secular mindset in 19th century Russia was Alexander Herzen, the father of Russian socialism, who argued that religion had ceased to be important in the lives of the educated classes. Herzen's friend and fellow socialist visionary, Vissarion Bilinsky, proclaimed that the peasants too were hardly Christian in the true sense of the word. He wrote in his famous letter to letter to Gogol, the Russian mujik utters the name of the Lord while scratching his behind. He says of the icon, if it isn't good for praying, it's good for covering the chamber pots. Take a closer look and you'll see that it is by nature a profoundly atheistic people. It still retains a good deal of superstition, but not a trace of religiosity. Certainly this is the impression Anton Chekhov gives in his story Peasants, written and published in 1897, whose portrait of the ignorance, filth, and drunkenness of the countryside created a sensation when it was published in partially censored form. In the story, we read the following. Maria and Fyokla crossed themselves, fasted, and took communion every year, but without any understanding of what they were doing. The children were not taught to pray. Nothing was told them about God, and no moral precepts were instilled into them. They were simply forbidden to eat certain foods on fast days. In other families, it was much the same. There were few who believed, few who understood. At the same time, they all loved the Holy Scripture, loved it tenderly, reverently, but they had no books. there was no one to read the Bible and explain it to them. And because Olga sometimes read them the Gospels, they respected her. And they respected her and addressed her and Sasha as their superiors. Herzen describes a similar situation in his own family in the late 1820s. He writes that his father, a wealthy nobleman from an ancient Russian family, quote, believed to some extent from habit, from a sense of decency and just in case, but notes that he never, quote, never himself observed any of the rules laid down by the church and received the local priest at his house not out of religious feeling, but rather as a concession to the ideas of society and the wishes of government. Herzen was told it was necessary to submit to such rites as were required by the church, but that he, quote, must avoid excessive piety, which is suitable for women of advanced age, but improper for a man. He was made to observe the Lenten fasting requirements, dreaded confession, and found church ceremonies impressive and awful. These are actual quotes. The divine liturgy caused him real fear, but no religious feeling. And when Easter brought an end to fasting, he ate all the Easter dishes and thought no more about religion for the rest of the year. But like the peasants in Chekhov's story, Herzen reserved a deep and sincere reverence for the gospel. In my early youth, he writes, I was often attracted by the Voltairean point of view. Mockery and irony were to my taste, but I don't remember ever taking up the gospel with indifference or hostility. This has accompanied me throughout life. At all ages and in all variety of circumstances, I have gone back to the reading of the gospel. And every time its contents have brought down peace and gentleness into my heart. For Herzen, the attractiveness of the Gospels had much to do with their theme of social justice, the cause which became for Herzen, quote, a religion of a different kind. For progressive thinkers like Herzen and Bielinski, there was no other kind of faith. Christ may have been an admirable moral teacher, but the religion founded in his name was already thoroughly discredited among many intellectuals. We only have to listen to the precocious teenager Kolya Krasotkin in Brothers Karamazov to understand to what extent it was fashionable in mid to late 18th century Russia to denounce religion, even while professing begrudging admiration for the figure of Jesus. Kolya tells Alyosha that he is not against Christ, who was, after all, quote, a very humane person, but as an, quote, incorrigible socialist, he believes that, quote, the Christian faith has only served the rich and noble so as to keep the lower classes in slavery. Kolya goes on to declare that Christ, were he alive today, quote, would go straight to join the revolutionaries and perhaps even play a conspicuous part. A bemused Alyosha can only wonder aloud how the teenager has managed to acquire such a conviction so quickly. Like Kolya Krasotkin's socialist conversion, the growth of a materialist worldview in 19th century Russia was swift, giving rise to the single most important paradigm shift in 19th century Russian culture, away from belief in God and toward belief in humanity instead. The growing decline in faith among the educated classes was no secret. All of Dostoevsky's post-Siberian exile works respond to it in one way or another, and it is a prominent theme in Nikolai Leskov's Cathedral Folk from 1872 and Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, 1877, where belief in God and Jesus Christ is viewed as incompatible with a modern educated outlook. In Anna Karenina, Lyovin struggles with belief in God, and the artist Mikhailov, laboring over his painting of Pilate's confrontation with Christ, flatly declares, quote, for an educated person, the question can no longer exist whether Jesus was divine. As we learned in the novel, religion was just a bridle for the barbarous part of the population that had nothing to do with the rest of society, who, like Anna's brother Stepan Oblonsky depicted here, quote, could not even stand through a short prayer service without aching feet and could not grasp the point of all those fearsome and high-blown words about the other world when life in this one could be so merry. Stepan's attitude is typical of the upper classes in Russia, many of whom, as Hugh MacLean points out, ceased to have any but casual contacts with the church. MacLean calls the widespread religious indifference of the upper classes and civil authorities, quote, a more serious threat to the church than the avowed atheism of the radicals at this time. A loss of faith in orthodoxy, however, does not mean the collapse of the desire to believe. When people become dissatisfied with the church, they often sought alternatives to it. We only have to recall Pierre's fleeing with Freemasonry in War and Peace, Tolstoy's description of the interest in table-turning spiritualism, mediums, and pietism in Anna Karenina, or the growing interest in evangelical Protestantism in Resurrection, to get a sense of the changing landscape of belief in 19th century Russia. If, however, we are to accept Tolstoy's assertion in Resurrection that most Russian believers, and not just the educated elite, were unreflective about the articles of their faith and simply, and this is Tolstoy's wonderful tautology, believed that this belief had to be believed in, then it is not difficult to understand how it was possible for the Bolsheviks to discredit and ultimately dismantle orthodoxy with such efficiency on Russian soil after the revolution. But in stating that the 19th century was a century of unbelief, I am nevertheless making more of a polemical argument than a factual assertion, partly because the historical reality is quite complicated, and partly because labeling writers as secular or religious is a somewhat dubious undertaking. What interests me more here, and what this idea of the century of unbelief helps me to understand, is the peculiar anxiety provoked in Russian writers by the intertwined questions of belief and the meaning and significance of Jesus. In calling the 19th century a century of unbelief, I'm seeking a label for that anxiety. Without a doubt, David Friedrich Strauss's Life of Jesus critically examined was an early source of anxiety and unbelief for Russian intellectuals. In it, Strauss rejects the divinity of Jesus as something implausible and unnecessary for the confirmation of humanity's divinity. He writes, in an individual, a God-man, the properties and functions which the church ascribes to Christ contradict themselves. In the idea of the race, they perfectly agree. Humanity is the union of the two natures, God become man, the infinite manifesting itself in the finite. The individual cannot be perfect or divine, but humanity can, for pollution cleaves to the individual only and does not touch the race. Strauss's view is essentially anthropocentric. It is humankind that, quote, dies and rises and ascends to heaven in successive generations, ever proceeding towards a higher spiritual life, a union with the infinite spirit of the heavens. By thus kindling within him the idea of humanity, the individual man participates in the divinely human life of the species, according to Strauss. Strauss's book, which circulated in Russia shortly after its publication in 1835, 3 years ahead of Tolstoy's encounter with the high schooler Volodya, Strauss's book was hugely influential. It had a profound impact on Belinsky, in whose circle, according to Dostoevsky, Strauss's name was spoken of, quote, very reverently. The Life of Jesus, critically examined alongside Ernest Renan's Life of Jesus, published 30 years later, came at a critical juncture in Russian culture. Dominant ideas imported from the West, such as German Romanticism or French utopian socialism, were waning. Strauss and other left Hegelian thinkers like Ludwig Feuerbach, in his book, The Essence of Christianity, 1841, stressed the anthropological essence of religion, preaching that man's salvation lay in his own hands through reliance on empiricism and reason. Human beings were to orient themselves, as Patrick Lally Michelson notes, not toward a supernatural or transcendental authority, but rather toward an anthropological ideal of rational man and purified personality. Humanity could attain authentic freedom only after man became conscious of the world historical fact that he was his own supreme being. The historical critical method played a particularly important role in the process of dethroning Christ, together with what Charles Taylor calls the cosmic imaginary, that is, the understanding introduced by advances in science in the 19th century that the universe was too vast to be contained or explained by the Christian narrative. The historical critical method called into question the explanatory authority of Christianity itself. No work accomplished this task better in Russia than Ernest Renan's revisionist biography of Jesus, The Life of Jesus. When it was published in 1863, 28 years after Strauss's work, Renan's Life of Jesus was almost immediately translated into over a dozen languages, including Russian, and it went through 13 editions in its first 2 years. Most importantly, Renan's Life of Jesus appeared during a decade when materialist outlooks were making important inroads into Russian educated society. Renan's book was particularly influential because he translated the dense intellectual debates of revisionist academic Christology into the clear, lyrical, and simple story of a charming Galilean preacher who introduced a new way of worship and of imaging Christ in first century Judea. In so doing, according to Albert Schweitzer, he summed up, quote, in a single book, the result of the whole process of German criticism, radically changing how Christ was understood. Both printed and hand-copied versions of the book circulated widely and were read in intellectual and popular circles. It was virtually mandatory reading among the intelligentsia, and Life of Jesus soon took its place alongside the works of Western materialists and Russian radicals as part of the required curriculum for aspiring progressives, especially after 1905, when censorship was relaxed and the work could be published legally in Russia. In an almost too perfect coincidence, Renan's Life of Jesus appeared the same year as the other most influential text of Russian secular humanism in the 19th century, Nikolai Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done? The two works together struck a double blow for secularism in the Russian century of unbelief. Renan's in its replacing of the God-man Christ with the mortal Jesus, and Chernyshevsky's in its proposal of a new prototype for humanity, the man-God, idealistic new people who perfect themselves, not in order to aspire to the likeness of Christ, but in order to bring about a new society based on reason and scientific knowledge. A whole generation of educated commoners, or raznochinцы, gathered around Chernyshevsky, uncompromising, eager for action, and willing to sacrifice themselves for the cause. Together with Chernyshevsky, they maintained that one could take a scientific approach to moral questions. What is to be Done emerged as the single most inspirational work of the revolutionary movement in Russia, thanks in large part to its portrait of its monkish true believer revolutionary, Rakhmetov. The novel thus marks a crucial moment in the movement from sacred to secular iconography. Rakhmetov was the new non-divine role model of social justice, not Christ. Vladimir Lenin himself took Rakhmetov as a prototype. He read What is to be Done after his brother was hanged for plotting the assassination of Alexander III, and the novel had a formative influence on him. Chernyshevsky, he later recalled, plowed me up more than anyone else. As a tribute, he named his 1902 work on the role and organization of the Bolshevik Party after the novel. And here it is for you right here. Both Chernyshevsky and Renan offered a secular role model for their readers. And each of these role models in turn reflects one of the two chief anxieties of the century of unbelief in Russia. Renan's compelling portrait of Jesus represents the rationalist overthrow of the God-man. Chernyshevsky's hagiography of Rakhmetov announces the advent of the new man-God of scientific materialism. Henceforth, all Christological battles had to be fought on these two fronts. It is on these two fronts that Russia's greatest novelist Christologists, Fyodor Dostoevsky and Leo Tolstoy, would wage their own holy wars. Two things were central to both authors' opposition to this new radical materialism. the conviction that Chernyshevsky and Renan were wrong, but also the distinct anxiety as to what their proper response should be. So part 2, let's look at what Dostoevsky felt the proper response would be. Part 2, belief in Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky's anxiety resolved as paradox. Paradox is at the center of the writer's works and his thinking about Christ. In his famous March 1854 letter to the Decemberist wife Natalia von Wiesina, he declares, "I'm a child of this century, a child of doubt and disbelief. I have been and shall ever be, that I know, until they close the lid of my coffin." At the same time, he nevertheless singles out a potent symbol of faith in his life, in which all is clear and sacred. He writes, and it's on the screen for you, "This symbol is very simple, and here's what it is. To believe that there is nothing more beautiful, more profound, more sympathetic, more reasonable, more courageous, and more perfect than Christ. And there not only isn't, but I tell myself with a jealous love, there cannot be. More than that, if someone succeeded in proving to me that Christ was outside the truth, and if indeed the truth was outside Christ, I would sooner remain with Christ than with the truth." All of the writer's future artistic method is on full display here. His love of hyperbole and contradiction, his use of assertion through negation, his allowing of unexpected outcomes, and perhaps most of all, his reluctance to make a straightforward, earnest declaration of faith. After all, isn't a declaration of faith in Christ outside the truth a declaration of doubt in the Christian profession of his native orthodoxy? For if Christ is not the truth, then isn't Christianity a false religion? Is Dostoevsky's credo then perhaps even a tacit admission of a possible atheism on the writer's part? Or is he instead using unbelief as a paradoxical way of affirming belief by making a negative formulation serve a positive end? Or finally, is Dostoevsky's symbol of faith ultimately meant to present an unresolvable contradiction, allowing for both possibilities at once, faith and unbelief, like the metaphysical gambits of the writer's later works, where one can find as many reasons not to believe as to believe? What a terrible torment this thirst to believe has cost me and is still costing me, Dostoevsky writes in his letter. And the stronger it becomes in my soul, the stronger are the arguments against it. The stronger my thirst to believe is, the stronger are the arguments against belief. So if doubt is faith's constant companion, then for Dostoevsky, it is also a kind of a necessary and dangerous goad. Indeed, unbelief is so strongly and convincingly articulated in his works precisely because it is also capable of revealing faith both dramatically and compellingly. In this way, unbelief can serve as a kind of apophatic theology in his works, a way of discerning God by affirming what God is not. This is how atheists might suddenly turn into believers, as Bishop Tikhon tells Stavrogin in Demons from 1872. A complete atheist stands on the next to last step to the most complete faith. In other words, the more convinced people are of the impossibility of the divine, the more complete is the negative space, the clearing of conceptual language that can enable a sudden and dramatic revelation of God. They may or may not take this step, Tikhon acknowledges, but complete faith is within their grasp. Dostoevsky's letter to von Wiesina is thus important not only because it speaks to the writer's state of mind about faith, but also because it anticipates his future methodology, for it is one of his first written provocations in which he probes given truths and seeks affirmation in seeming refutation. But these sudden reversals work in both directions. In defending his novel Demons about the revolutionary and conspirator Sergei Nechayev, whose ruthless murder of one of his collaborators and eventual arrest in 1869 received sensational coverage in the Russian press, Dostoevsky even turns Tikhon's Apathetic formulation on its head, dismissing the notion floated in the press that only the, quote, idle and underdeveloped could be radicalized the way Nietzsche's followers were. Dostoevsky uses his own life story to suggest that the opposite is more likely, that, quote, diligent, ardent young people who were in fact studying and who possessed good hearts, unquote, are the very ones most likely to turn into Nietzscheans and Nietzschevists. Indeed, Dostoevsky declares that this is what happened to him. I myself am an old Nietzscheivist. I also stood on the scaffold condemned to death, and I assure you that I stood in the company of educated people. Here he is referring, of course, to his own involvement in the Petrosevsky Circle, an oppositionist group of intellectuals arrested by Tsar Nikolai's secret police in 1849 and resulting in Dostoevsky's near execution. Dostoevsky's point is that if the utopian socialism of his youth could have given birth to the radical materialists of the present day, then any ideal is susceptible to sudden and extreme change, a theme worked out explicitly in Demons. As if to emphasize this point, Dostoevsky reveals that he himself came from, quote, a family that was Russian and pious, who knew the Gospels virtually from earliest childhood. And while he blames all these John Stuart Mills and Darwins and Strausses for leading today's educated youth astray with their marked secularism, and rails against the amazing lengths the human mind can go, having rejected Christ, the fact remains that Dostoevsky was nevertheless living proof of the possibility that someone piously raised on the Gospels could still become an old Nietzscheivist, that is, a person for whom the most ardent faith may turn suddenly and dramatically into the most passionate atheism. Dostoevsky's final novel, Brothers Karamazov, is structured on these kinds of potential and dramatic reversals, and I'll conclude with a few words about it. Brothers Karamazov is a novel of paradoxes, chief of which is the fact that it is as much about unbelief as it is about belief. Indeed, I argue that it is Ivan, not Alyosha, who is the central figure of the novel, despite the narrator's insistence that Alyosha is his unlikely hero. Dostoevsky needs a self-professed atheist to chart the novel's via negativa towards faith, for he feared that an earnest, ardent defense of Christ was no longer possible in the age of skepticism. A vindication of Christ could only succeed if it were somehow concealed, introduced obliquely, or disguised as something else, such as a revolt against God or a profession of atheism. Thus, Brothers Karamazov, like all of Dostoevsky's mature works, occupies a middle theological position, somewhere between faith and skepticism, inhabiting what Charles Taylor calls the space of cultural cross pressures, where faith positions are made fragile by the challenges of science, reason, and progressive social attitudes on the one hand, but are simultaneously bolstered by the sense of the inadequacy of these narratives of closed immanence on the other. Ivan embodies the novel's negative theology as the only character who deploys an apophatic approach to discerning the divine, for he bases his rebellion against God on the premise that the human mind can never comprehend God, which is, of course, the starting point for all apophatic inquiries. From his pronouncement about everything being permitted if there is no God, to his poem about the Grand Inquisitor, Ivan is constantly telling us what God is not, the better for us, perhaps, and for him, to glimpse what God might be. Father Zosima is the first person who seems to glimpse something apophatic about Ivan's atheism. In particular, he sees how Ivan's notion that there is no virtue if there is no immortality hides an affirmation in its negative formulation. On the one hand, it proposes that in the absence of God, quote, nothing would be immoral any longer. Everything would be permitted, even anthropophagy. It is thus a provocation If we cannot prove the existence of God, we cannot insist on virtue. On the other hand, Ivan's formula can be read in the opposite fashion as a negative affirmation of God, as Zosima hints when he tells Ivan, "You are blessed if you believe so, or else most unhappy." Ivan is unhappy if he truly does not believe in virtue, God, and immortality. He is blessed, however, if he is using this negative formulation as a way of journeying toward God. Zosima's optimistic take goes something like this: God must exist, for I see that people are not devouring each other. There is virtue, so there must be God. In his response, Zosima reveals Ivan's negative formulation as something that can affirm belief. The most dramatic and weighty example of apatheticism in the novel is Ivan's poem of the Grand Inquisitor. D.H. Lawrence characterized it as, quote, "the final unanswerable criticism of Christ, a deadly, devastating summing up," unquote, of how Jesus has failed humanity. Dostoevsky himself called Ivan's poem, quote, "a powerful denial of God." And yet, if there's any doubt that this bitter critique of Christ and Christianity, with its blasphemies, clever temptations, and damning indictments, can somehow be understood as an apophatic affirmation of Christ, we only have to listen to what Alyosha Karamazov says when his brother Ivan finishes narrating. "But that's absurd. Your poem praises Jesus. It doesn't revile him." Alyosha's reaction is astounding given what he has just heard in Ivan's poem, and it is remarkable that so few critics have dwelt on its seeming inappropriateness. How does Ivan's damning denunciation of Christ's teachings wind up praising Jesus? It cannot, unless it does so apophatically, by articulating that which is not Christ. Alyosha recognizes this fact. What the Grand Inquisitor says about Christ is nothing like the Christ of the Gospels, nor can it be. His Christ is a negative distortion. Miracle, mystery, and authority, the pillars on which the Grand Inquisitor has created his deformed and perverse church, have nothing to do with Jesus, as the two acts Jesus performs in the poem reminds us. An instance in where Ivan seems to have slyly sabotaged his own argument. Healing and forgiveness, Jesus' raising of the dead child at the beginning of the poem, and the kiss he bestows on the Grand Inquisitor at the end, are the essence of the Jesus of the Gospels, and they help us to distinguish the real Christ from the false one of the Inquisitor. So Alyosha grasps all this immediately in his excited reaction to his brother's poem. The negative portrait of Jesus and his message only serve in Ivan's poem only serves to set off in vivid contrast the virtue of Christ and the gospel he preached. We are meant to see this along with Alyosha. Ivan has given us a negative path toward Christ, who is to be found paradoxically in his absence. Now, we should be aware that a negative path toward the Godhead is not yet a declaration of belief. Ivan is still struggling with belief and does so to the end of the novel. He understands that he must renounce reason in order to be able to attain imperfect ignorance. I'm sorry, I'm going to skip this slide here because I'm running out of time. He understands he must renounce reason. He must come to understand that he must renounce reason, quote, in order to be able to attain imperfect ignorance, to union with him who transcends all being and all knowledge. As Vladimir Lossky reminds us here, we must draw near to the unknown in the darkness of absolute ignorance. This is the apophatic lesson that Ivan must learn. But negative theology has its own risks, because in emptying oneself of all concepts of God, one may lose God as well. And this is something that Ivan is experiencing. If the Brothers Karamazov is an apophatic novel, then it too may lead us to a negative space from which we find it difficult to return. And that is where we leave Ivan. His state of unconsciousness at the novel's end is symbolic of the state of apophatic darkness he has reached, but we do not know whether he will emerge from this state a convert to faith or a confirmed atheist. This tension underscores his special role in the novel and reminds us that it is Ivan, not Alyosha, who is the book's great metaphysical quester. The novel's greatest seeker of faith is actually its greatest skeptic. So The Brothers Karamazov, we find out, is a book about the difficulty of believing. And doubt haunts all of the Karamazov brothers, even Alyosha himself, who declares to Lise that he might not truly believe in God. It is not surprising then that while the ending of The Brothers Karamazov seems to point to the ultimate victory of good, figured in the, the joyous cries of hurrah for Karamazov that the boys shower upon Alyosha, in truth, important questions are left unresolved, especially about faith, a fitting outcome, given the prominence of the book's apathetic impulse. Thus, instead of a conclusion that would definitively resolve the novel's narrative and metaphysical questions, everything, most of all, the question of belief, is left up in the air. And yet, Dostoevsky's reticence at the end of Brothers Karamazov, his reluctance to let faith have the final say, is itself characteristic of his apathetic approach to Christ and the Godhead. In the novel and in life, Dostoevsky admits as much in a July 1876 letter, where he explains the danger of fully disclosing one's thoughts. Deploy any paradox you like, but do not explain it completely, and everyone will think it is witty and subtle and comme il faut. But follow some risky pronouncement to its very end. Declare, for instance, directly and without beating around the bush, this is exactly what the Messiah is, and no one will believe you, precisely because of your naivete, precisely because you disclosed your idea fully and said what you meant, down to the last letter. For this reason, Dostoevsky writes, I have never allowed myself to spell out certain of my convictions or have my full say in my writings. His implication is clear. Better the negative way of disclosure than the explicit, the apophatic, not the cataphatic. Better a book where unbelief predominates, the better, perhaps, to glimpse belief. And that, in sum, is the state of belief in Dostoevsky's works and Dostoevsky's Russia. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to answer questions and maybe fill in some gaps in some areas that I had to skip in my talk. Thank you very much.
Excellent. John, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Just to make sure. Great. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk full of great ideas. There are questions coming in. First of all, let's start with a definition. Stephen Dean is asking, and it makes perfect sense. What does apathetic mean?
So apathetic comes from apatheticism. It's a kind of theology more prominent in the Eastern Church than the Western Church, which, though, again, it has its roots as early as the 3rd century in the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius. And it basically says that since using any conceptual language about God limits God, we have to actually perform exercises to clear all conceptual language and all conceptual ideas about God from our mind in order to achieve a kind of trans-rational and ecstatic union with God. So the apophatic theological exercise is to say what God is not, because anything that we say about God limits the unlimitable one. And my argument is that there is a kind of apophatic literary method in the 4 novelists that I look at in my book. All of them are very aware that they are writing under conditions in which belief is under assault in both the 19th and the 20th century. And so rather than coming out and making a kind of forward-facing and affirmative defense of belief and a positive heroic depiction of Christ and all of his virtues, they do so by displacement and inversion and through indirection, through failed Christ figures, and novels such as The Idiot, where virtuous people like the Pushkin seem to fail in their mission to bring about a better world in a Christ-like fashion.
Excellent, thank you. And just for everyone's to be on the same page, it's spelled Apophatic. So, and you guys can look up the Greek roots of the word in your spare time. You mentioned The Idiot, and I definitely want to follow up on that, because we have one of the questions from one of my students from this semester, and we're actually we're 2/3 of the way through through The Idiot. Lucy Sobel asks, in the case of Pushkin, would he be mainly styled after the God-man being overthrown? And let me use Lucy's question to just ask you to situate The Idiot in Dostoevsky's, evolution of views and his approach to Christ, and how to conceive him in a contemporary society, in his contemporary society.
Well, so Dostoevsky had this idea: what would happen if we brought someone, dropped him in, dropped him into St. Petersburg? Someone who is as close to Christ as possible, but without divine attributes. So Pushkin is dropped into Petersburg society from his asylum in Switzerland. And he comes into town, St. Petersburg of the 1860s, which is highly mercantile and mercenary. And he is this innocent released into this debased setting, to see what happens when this kind of embodiment of innocence and good has to bump up against this kind of cynical, mercenary reality. Now, he didn't, the interesting point that about Pushkin is that he is funny. He's absurd. In fact, in my case study, and it is actually one of the major case studies, the brother Karamazov is sort of is part of a side chapter. The main case study for Dostoevsky is The Idiot in my book. The interesting thing about Pushkin is that he's described as smyshnoi, and that in Russian means comic, it means absurd, it means ridiculous. And the epithet is smyshnoi is repeated a dozen times in part one. And eventually, of course, the epithet idiot is also attaches itself to his name. He gets involved in all sorts of ridiculous comic situations. So what is happening here? What is Dostoevsky doing, bringing this embodiment of grace and beauty, but in a sense, profaning it somewhat by making it ridiculous? To my mind, he is setting up a kind of an apathetic investigation. Christianity, Christ can't be ridiculous. You can't laugh at that, at this embodiment of grace and beauty that Christ is. So why set Pushkin up this way? And I won't give away the ending of the novel for your students since you're not there yet. But what happens at the end? Does Pushkin succeed somehow in bringing about a change of hearts and preventing evil in the world? Well, Dostoevsky is very mindful that he doesn't want to depict a kind of ideal. He wants to estrange this Christ figure, and to get us to try to think about him from an apathetic kind of perspective, to maybe glimpse what Christ-like virtues he might embody, how that the contrast will come out more dramatically, and he won't be accused of making Pushkin into an ideal who simply conquers all through his charm and his innocence.
I found it particularly very interesting, and the kids and I discussed this in our seminar. This Tuesday? Pushkin in Dostoevsky's *Idiot*. This is for everyone a novel from the very late 1860s. Pushkin never preaches. There are no sermons that he gives. He seems to be a figure, yes, as you mentioned, dropped in the middle of things and sort of a 360-degree mirror that reflects plenty, certainly creates situations, but never teaches the way you would expect from a more traditional religious figure, and not only in Christianity. That's just a comment, but the questions are piling in, so let me get to them. This is great. So this one from Tom Pedrick, an AU alum, someone who suffered through more than one of my classes, which I take it is why he's given himself over to religion at this point in life. Dr. Gibbons, I've long been inspired by Dostoevsky's psychological and social insights into 19th century Russia. But how can I better reconcile my atheism with his emphasis on redemption through Christianity?
Well, this is interesting because, it was Nabokov who and this is, text from the back of my book. It was Nabokov who complained about the number of Dostoevsky's characters, quote, sinning their way to Jesus. But when you think about it, Christ is actually an elusive figure in many of his works. And as I was mentioning in my talk, Dostoevsky presents as many reasons in his novels not to believe as to believe. He presents some very convincing arguments against Christianity. And in fact, when he finished writing the Grand Inquisitor part of the Brothers Karamazov, he was very concerned that he could present a sufficient counter in the novel, a sufficient narrative to counter the Grand Inquisitor in his novel. He worried about that, as he said, what am I going to do now? I've created this poem that really, everyone recognizes as this damning indictment of Christ and the Christian enterprise, and how it sets up humanity to fail because of these high ideals preached on the Sermon on the Mount, these things that, that these teachings that say, you were taught do not commit adultery, but I say, even if you look at someone with lust, you've committed adultery, right? Those sorts of things, or loving your enemies. These are such ridiculously high ideals, no one can be saved. So this is what the Grand Inquisitor critique of Christianity is, and Dostoevsky really spares nothing in expressing atheist viewpoints. In fact, I have to say, we think of the Brothers Karamazov and the depiction of Zosima as this vindication of orthodoxy, or at least that's an argument that's been made about it by Dostoevsky himself. And yet the Orthodox Church at the time the novel was being published, they were not a great fan of the depiction of orthodoxy in the novel, particularly the idea of the institution of the elders and Zosima himself and Zosima's teachings in the novel. So in many ways, there's an appearance of a pro-Christian bias, but if you dig a little deeper, as I'm implying in my analysis of Brothers Karamazov, even Brothers Karamazov is a novel that leaves things up in the air at the end. And in fact, this is something that wasn't in my talk, Dostoevsky seemed, according to reminiscences by his contemporaries, his idea for the sequel was to have Alyosha lose his faith, become a revolutionary, and make an attempt on the life of the Tsar. So there you go. Alyosha losing his faith, complete faith turning into complete atheism, just as Tikhon said in reverse. So in essence, if you look closely and scratch the surface of a Dostoevsky novel, you find a lot of unbelief, because unbelief haunted Dostoevsky and it haunts his novels.
Super. Let's go on to the next one. Anna Gibbons. What other examples of apathetic faith do we see in Russian literature?
Well, you have to read my book. So here's just to give you a sense of this idea. I picked 4 case studies. Dostoevsky's The Idiot, Tolstoy's Resurrection, a very ironically named novel, since the novel really promotes a different kind of non-divine Jesus, It promotes a kind of a divinity of Jesus's teachings, but a non-divinity of Jesus himself. Bulgakov's Master Margarita and Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. And those two novels, the last two novels, are the great Eastern novels of the Soviet century. To give you an example, well, you can look at Master Margarita, where the devil visits Moscow in Stalin's 1930s, and encounters a writer who has written a novel about Pontius Pilate depicting a Jesus that looks nothing like the Christ of the Gospels. What is the purpose of that? The purpose of that is to perhaps say what you know about Jesus from the Gospel, you have to estrange. You have to do something different to it. So I'm giving you Yeshua HaNotzri, God Notzri, who is nothing like the Jesus of the Gospels that you encountered, in order for you to see more clearly what Jesus might actually be. That's an example of an apophatic literary approach. Or for instance, Dr. Zhivago. Zhivago himself carries a lot of Christian imagery, a lot of Christian semantic freight, but he is a womanizer. He has affairs with 3 women. He produces 5 children by 3 different women, and 3 of them are out of wedlock. How is he a Christ figure? But he writes these beautiful poems about a very traditional Christ. How do you reconcile all of that? There's a kind of apatheticism that's going on in Pasternak's depiction of Zhivago, a negativity that reveals, that affirms, actually.
Excellent. Sayam Hussein, to what extent do you believe Dostoevsky lives between the sacred and the profane? Does he ever achieve a spiritual apotheosis through his writings or other means? Thank you for your insightful perspective.
It's a very good question. Dostoevsky's Christianity in his novels is always hedged, in my view. It's always hedged. It's never presented in a triumphalist way. Dostoevsky's Christianity in his nonfiction writings is often presented in a political fashion to support views of nationalism or a kind of quasi monarchy stance on his part. I personally think that Dostoevsky struggled with belief all of his life, the way many people struggle. I mean, Mother Teresa herself admits to feeling nothing when she prayed for many years, late in her life, and everyone thought she was a saint. I think Dostoevsky and a lot of people who are believers have a hard time not banishing doubt from their minds. And so when Dostoevsky wrote in his 1854 letter that he was a child of doubt and disbelief and would remain so until they nailed the coffin, the lid of his coffin down over him, I think he meant it. I think he died in that state of wondering, the way many believers do. Is this really the truth? So I would say he was in that state in between those two extremes all of his life.
Excellent. From Melvin Thomas, how do Vladimir Solovyov and the symbolists fit into the age of unbelief? He's got it in quotations in Russia.
Right. Well, they're the ones who at the end of the 19th century start to turn the tide of the age of unbelief into the age of belief. And of course, I won't launch into the symbolists' views of religion, Christ, belief are very complicated, but suffice it to say that they, and I do have a chapter in each before. I have a kind of a summation chapter of the 19th century and the 20th century in terms of the major kinds of things going on in society. And so I talk about the symbolists somewhat in the book. They start to return to the questions of belief at the turn of the century. And in many ways, they prepare for what I call in my book, the century of belief, the Soviet century, which is not fully an ironic appellation, because simply what the Soviet state does is simply overlay on the Christian foundation of Russia a new kind of religious ideology in the new Bolshevik Soviet ideal political reality. The symbolists were kind of key in that transition period. The early Bolsheviks, the Commissar of Enlightenment, Lunacharsky, was a God builder, someone who felt that there are aspects of religiosity that should be injected into the Soviet ideology of the young state. It didn't last long, but just think if, for instance, about the decision in 1924 to preserve Lenin's body in a mausoleum, like as if it were the incorruptible remains of an Orthodox saint. So the symbolists were the pivot between the century of belief and the century of the century of unbelief and the century of belief, but in a very idiosyncratic way.
That's right. A godless belief, one could say, in the case of the Bolsheviks, of course, which brings us to another question very nicely from Gabriella Cellis. Have you ever read Yuri Dombrowski? His Keeper of Antiquities speaks about the God-man versus the man-God and is written in the time of Stalin. Is this man-God still discussed today in academia?
Well, so the man God, and I actually talk about Dombrowski's faculty of useless things in my conclusion, because it is one of the post-Stalin novels that return to the depiction of Christ's crucifixion on some level in the pages of the novel. The idea of the man God. In many ways, it never quite leaves the Soviet century, because if the ideology is that we can't, that there's nothing beyond the material reality, and again, that was the foundational belief of the Soviet state, and that this is a materialist, first in the world, atheist state, then human beings become of the apex of achievement and the apex of development, and we're the ones who can reverse the courses of rivers, conquer the cosmos, conquer the Arctic, do godlike things with the aid of our hands and our technology and our minds. So that idea never really escapes the sphere of Russian thought, though it's not really expressed that way. They're not talking about the man God in Brezhnev's Russia, for instance, and he was the leader of the Soviet Union for almost as long as Stalin.
Yeah, excellent. Rita Safaryans, would you say that Dostoevsky is using a theological version of Lotman's minus device, minus priyom, in crafting his approach to belief? And if so, how would this impact the existing understanding of Dostoevsky's poetics?
Well, it's an interesting idea, and that's a parallel idea to the kind of adaptation of apatheticism, which again is a theological practice that I did in my book. The idea that opposites reveal. That we know the classic idea of literary foils. A foil is someone who reveals by contrast, and apathetic depictions of belief, of faith of Christ in the novels that I analyze are operating along those lines. But I did not pursue. I did not think of Lotman's minus device when I was thinking about this book, because it felt like the writers, particularly of the 19th century, who knew Russian monasticism, and this certainly was Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, knew the practices of hesychism, this sort of silence, this sort of prayerful silence, this eschewing of language and of conceptual thinking about God was in the air, and therefore I feel reflected in the pages of these novelists in the 19th century. and then infecting the novelists of the 20th century who so depended on, who of course were influenced by them, Bulgakov by Dostoevsky, and Pasternak by Tolstoy.
Super. Greg Blake Miller, how does the structure of The Idiot, we're back to The Idiot, in which the presumptive hero, Pushkin, disappears for long stretches, fit into the apathetic analysis?
Well, it's interesting because Dostoevsky wrote that novel without a plan. He had a plan, he threw out the window, he wrote part one, part one's brilliant, of course, and then didn't know what was going to happen next. So he introduces a gap in time. And so what happens is you have a very tightly structured part one and part four, and then you have parts 2 and 3 that sag. I hope you warned your students about parts 2 and 3 sagging a bit. And all these other characters start to come in and fill pages and pages of text, including Hippolyte Terentiev, who has his great necessary explanation. And in fact, when Dostoevsky writes his necessary explanation, he calls it and Hippolyte the axis on which the whole novel turns. Now, Greg Miller, how is that possible that at this point in time, Dostoevsky has given up on Pushkin and now says Hippolyte is the axis on which the whole novel turns? Well, think about it. Hippolyte is an atheist. He doesn't believe in God, especially because he is an 18-year-old, I believe, who has a death sentence, will not live into his 20s, and is personally wounded by God. If God exists, why is he doing this to me? So he stands as the atheist who reveals belief because he's bringing up those questions that belief must grapple with. And he takes textual space away from Pushkin because, again, Pushkin's function is much the same. It's displacement. So I think it's a very natural outcome of the kind of approach that Dostoevsky is, the kind of method he's deploying in The Idiot, that other characters should step into the spotlight the way Hippolyte does, and does so well that he convinces his creator Dostoevsky that he is now the axis on which the whole novel turns.
Do you then believe, and this is following, there's another question from Jonathan Schneider, one of my students now. Do you have insights into Hippolyte's character in regard to his beliefs and Dostoevsky's worldview? You kind of answered that a second ago, but do you believe that Hippolyte really is sort of a place filler, or is there more there that Dostoevsky used him to get across?
Oh no, Dostoevsky became quite excited by what Hippolyte presents in the novel. But the more of Hippolyte that we hear, the less of Pushkin we hear. And you made the very apt comment that we never hear Pushkin preach because other people preach. But what is Hippolyte preaching? He's preaching a kind of a wounded narcissism and a cry of his soul that he has been smited by the universe and denied life's feast. So he becomes this powerful negative expression of in the novel that belief and faith must overcome. I mean, one of the best lines in the novel in my mind is when Hippolyte turns to Pushkin at one point and says, "What can you tell the likes of me, people who are condemned and are going to die? What shall we do about all of you who are enjoying life?" And Pushkin turns to him and says, "Pass us by and forgive us our happiness." It's an incredible statement that he makes because Pushkin understands that this is one of those imponderable mysteries that to be able to do that, if Hippolyte's able to do that, he's actually crossed that threshold into belief. If he can pass them by and forgive them their happiness, he's already somehow turned his negative position into a kind of an affirmation, and therefore maybe crossed into the area of belief in something beyond his limited material existence, which soon will end.
Do you believe that Pushkin was intended to be an asexual character? I mean that as a character not terribly interested in in sexual passion?
Au contraire. I believe that Pushkin has two great loves in the novel. The first is Nastasia Philippovna, to whom he makes two marriage proposals. After all, the guy's got there's something that we have to deal with here. We have to address about his erotic or non-erotic nature. But the first marriage proposal is utterly non-erotic. He is making a proposal based out of mercy, out of compassion,
Right.
out of the desire to save this poor woman. But he falls in love with Aglaya. Everyone knows he's in love. Everyone can see that he behaves that way. He may not, and there are scenes in which he is vaguely aware but denies it. He may not admit it to himself, but his love for Aglaya is a love of eros. His love for Nastasia Philippovna is one of agape. But you see, Aglaya, ironically and paradoxically, does not have erotic love for him. She has agape love for him. He is the vehicle by which she can go out and do good deeds in the world, because she has made out of him this ideal, this paragon of goodness and virtue, when all he really wants, if he really admitted it to himself, is a normal life with this pretty daughter of the Apanchin family.
Excellent. And perfect. We're just at the end of our time. Another question from Lucy Solberg, again, a student of mine, where they're suffering through the idiot right now and enjoying it at the same time, enlightening themselves. Do you believe Dostoevsky's emphasis on Christian love and morality can still be thoroughly embraced by an atheist?
It's a very good question. I would say so, in the same way in which Pushkin deals with Hippolyte. He doesn't make Hippolyte become a believer or require that of him for Hippolyte to understand something about how one might live in a more loving fashion. In that phrase, pass us by and forgive us our happiness. If that is an act that Hippolyte can do, it already moves him to a level of Christian love, right? That is, sort of self-sacrificing, objectless. I mean, it's hard to love the happiness of others when you are under a death sentence, right? But if Hippolyte can do that, he is committing an act of this kind of ideal love that Dostoevsky is promoting. So I think it's possible. And I think most atheists would say our values are every bit as high and lofty as Christian values. But Dostoevsky would say, yes, but there's one difference. Your values are you're arguing that your values are derived from human beings, are man-made values, and man-made morality is a slippery slope. What I'm arguing about the necessity of Christian values, Dostoevsky would say, is that they do not originate in human beings, and they are high and hard and paradoxical. And that's the thing about Christian beliefs that he says would, kind of puts the lie to the idea that we ourselves can come up with these things. And you only have to look at what human beings have done with civic laws that, like, for instance, and this is something that comes up in the Idiot, sanctioning capital punishment to show what happens when human beings make the moral laws. When human beings make the moral laws, murder is allowed. Executions. So that's why he would say, you may get there and say that this is just comes from you, but see, look what happens when you do that. You see, God would never allow capital punishment. The kind of God revealed by Jesus Christ. That would be Dostoevsky's answer, if I could be so bold.
And you can. Excellent. Thank you very much. We're right at the end of our time. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. The book is The Image of Christ in Russian Literature, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Bulgakov, Pasternak, 2018, soon to be out in paperback. John Givens, thank you very much for your time, your effort, a wonderful and visually stimulating presentation. And for all of our guests, we hope to see you for our next installment of the Dostoevsky Talk. And with that, I'm signing off. Thank you for your questions and thank you for your time. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you, everyone.